He's already said I was one of the co-researchers on the MAP project. And for me, this was such an amazing and wonderful experience. I got to meet a vast group of people from a cross-section of America that I never would have had the chance to meet. And one of the persons that made a really big impact on me was Sean. He was in the picture that was in the picture earlier. He's from the Navajo tribe in Gallup, New Mexico. And you know, a lot of people come to this country and not a lot of us know about the original Americans and how they live and their life, and it's really kind of interesting and powerful. So, with that said, the dimension I chose, they gave me notes, they gave me everything, because I can go off the rail, and as Dr. Shara has experienced, I can really touch the third rail. So the dimension I chose to speak about today is a lack of adequate health and well-being. This dimension is important to me because as a long-term survivor of HIV and an activist who have been involved in the U.S. healthcare system for over the past 3 decades, healthcare plays a key role in my life. Poverty impacts physical and mental well-being of those affected by it. Poverty creates chronic conditions that are known to lead to a shorter lifespan. Sean, an activist with a direct experience of poverty and a researcher on our national team, told us that the life expectancy on some Native American reservation is around 48 years old, with a high rate of suicide. People, including children, commit suicide because they don't see a future for themselves or for their families. It is a direct result of suffering in silence, and as one of the researchers expressed. The fact is, when you are living in poverty, you die sooner. Poverty is a trauma. It leaves a mark on people and communities like footprints on the body and the mind. We all see the visible signs of hardship and poverty in our communities, on the buses, trains, and streets. Chronic conditions, shorter lifespan, mental and physical trauma. This is the weight of poverty on people. To improve well-being and healthcare are obvious solutions. Access to facilities and providers and affordable health care can prevent this trauma and footprint. We could hope that in front of such a dire need, we would organize ourselves to answer those needs, but we don't. In fact, the question of health and well-being shows just how unfair and unequal our society is. I know I am lucky to have healthcare coverage, and how odd does that sound to say? I am lucky to have healthcare coverage. How odd is it for me to even say that, if you only knew? In a rich, developed country like the US in the year 2019. But I only have it because of all those activists before me who fought for it. Shouldn't everyone have the same access to equal coverage or quality coverage that I have? During our research, an activist in Oakland described our healthcare system as third world country conditions within the US, a wealthy country. And an activist in New Orleans described the healthcare that is available to people in poverty as just enough to keep you alive sometimes. I would like to circle back to what was said earlier about subjugation and how, at the end of the day, poverty is about how much control you have over your life. That is true too for the dimension I chose to talk about tonight. When you live in poverty, you have no or very little control on what your body looks like or how it makes you suffer from too much stress, anxiety, and hard working conditions. And that goes even deeper. In both rural and urban areas, people have told us about environmental conditions that they have no control over that result in ill health consequences. Lead in the water and soil, carcinogens in the air and water and soil. In rural areas like Appalachia, people have told us about black and brown lung disease due to coal mining and coal dust in the air. In Gallup, New Mexico, they told us about the uranium in the groundwater and soil. In New York City's East Harlem, asthma is prevalent. Let's talk about accessibility to services. During our research, people in Appalachia told us about having to travel 2 hours or longer by car to access medical care or to visit a doctor. And what do you do if you don't drive or have a car? And the barriers poverty put in front of you are not only physical. Even here in Boston, where there are multiple healthcare facilities, people can't afford coverage or can't afford the co-pays. When you have to decide between copay and food, what do you do? Do you let your child go without, or do you try to deal with your illness on your own? How do you deal with that type of stress and anxiety on top of being sick? Health is the engine in the vicious cycle of poverty. It fuels the cycle over and over and over. Let me conclude. Poverty is a trauma, and poverty is a trauma because poverty is violent. It impacts our body and our minds. And this trauma may be passed to the next generation if we as a community don't gather means to address it properly. Second, poorer you are, multidimensionally speaking, the more likely you are not to have control over your own health and well-being. Third, healthcare system is a dramatic mirror of how our society is unfair and unequal. And in closing, I wanted to, because we couldn't finish our closing, and how do I drive this message home to you? And I wanted to kind of put things in perspective. In accordance with all of this research that we talked about and we've dealt with in healthcare, one of our mantra was all politics is local. And with that said, this is Dr. Sherrod. Dr. Sherrod, can you stand up, please? Dr. Sherrod and I worked at Whittier Street Health Center. I don't know if you guys know about the saga of Whittier Street Health Center. It's been in the news a lot. We were both fired. I was a peer advocate. I would go out into the poor communities that were homeless, people dealing with addiction, methadone mile, if you're familiar with that, and people from the ghettos and the hood area that we would recruit to come and get care. Dr. Sherrod is a primary care physician. Him and I was put against each other by the CEO. I'm just a peer advocate, mind you. And then he was forced out, and I was fired and dropped from my health care. Over the past year, we have been involved in this trying to make this right, because as a HIV/AIDS activist, I have been living in Boston for some while, and I've been coming to Boston from New Hampshire to be on the Title I Planning Council. If you don't know about the Title I Planning Council, the Title I Planning Council, it divides money coming down from the federal government, and one of those programs is called the Minority AIDS Initiative. And from the I'm not done with you yet. And from the 90s to now, I have seen it. It's when it started at its height, it was like in the 30s and 40s of millions of dollars each year, because that program was level funded. It was supposed to come into our community to provide care for the minorities. Does it look like that has happened between then and now? All of the clinics and hospitals that were managing those funds are on this side of the city. What has happened? And as we know, gun violence and other types of violent forms of crimes have been happening on that side of the city, and they have gone unchecked. We are dealing with a community that is at its breaking point. We are left out and subjugated. And none of the politicians we went to, none of the entities that are supposed to be looking out for us has said a word, has stepped in. And this community is just left out to dry. So with that said, I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope that we can come to some kind of conclusion, but that's my story. Thank you.